In this video, we'll continue on with the brain mechanisms of movement, specifically the basal ganglia. So here's the basal ganglia, located deep in the interior of the brain. And we'll go through the specific regions of the basal ganglia on the next few slides. So the basal ganglia, we've heard of it before, so it should sound familiar, and it's responsible for initiating an action not guided by a stimulus. So initiating a movement. In other words, it's a self-initiated movement. So another way of thinking about these self-initiated movements, so again, there's nothing in the environment stimulating us to do it. It's something we internally want to do, like standing up or walking across the room or driving a car or riding a bike. What kind of movements are, or what kind of self-initiated movements are they? What do you think they involve? Something that we talked about in a previous chapter. A certain type of memory. Procedural memories. So remember we said that the basal ganglia is where those procedural memories are stored, and that's why when you have hippocampal damage, your procedural memories remain intact. They're implicit. They're something we don't think about. And so again, it's a self-initiation of a movement. The basal ganglia is composed of the following structures: the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. And again, we've seen all this before. So far, not much new, except for maybe thinking about it in terms of just procedural memories, that it's a self-initiated movement. And here's those different components of the basal ganglia. So here we have the putamen, and here's the globus pallidus. We have a medial part and we have a lateral part. Sometimes people call it the interior and exterior. But you can think of it as the medial and the lateral part of the globus pallidus. Here's that thalamus that sits in the middle of the brain. It's not really part of the basal ganglia, but it plays an intricate role in what the basal ganglia does. Here's the subthalamic nucleus. Here's the substantia nigra. Now the substantia nigra, remember I said I often include it in my description of the basal ganglia because it projects to this basal ganglia. And that's what we're going to see is important and disrupted in Parkinson's disease. Oh, and then up here is that caudate nucleus. So this is just showing you how it's deep in the interior of the brain, but just showing you where it would be located. So these are the projections of the basal ganglia, okay, in terms of what neurotransmitters are involved. So we have dopamine, glutamate, and GABA. Now remember, GABA is our main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So when GABA is released into a group of neurons, it's going to inhibit them and keep them from firing action potentials. Glutamate, on the other hand, is our major excitatory neurotransmitter. So when glutamate's released into a group of neurons, it's going to excite those and make them more likely to fire an action potential. So the substantia nigra is going to project to the caudate. And so remember we said that the substantia nigra contains dopamine producing cells. And so those axons are going to project to the caudate and release dopamine on the receiving neurons in the caudate putamen. The caudate putamen contains GABA producing neurons. And so its neurons, when its axons will extend to this globus pallidus, specifically the internal part of the globus pallidus, and when they release GABA, they'll inhibit the globus pallidus. Now the globus pallidus also contains GABA-producing neurons, and it has axons that project to the thalamus. So when the globus pallidus fires action potentials, it inhibits the thalamus. The thalamus, on the other hand, contains glutamate-producing neurons, which are excitatory. So when the thalamus sends action potentials and releases glutamate in the motor cortex, it stimulates those motor cortex neurons to initiate a movement. So there's some other stuff going on here, but we're just going to concern ourselves with this projection right here. We're not going to worry about this feedback right now at all either, just substantia nigra to the caudate, to the globus pallidus, to the thalamus, to the motor cortex. It may seem complicated, but we're going to hopefully break it all down. So what happens when the globus pallidus inhibits the thalamus? So if the globus pallidus inhibits the thalamus, is the thalamus going to stimulate the motor cortex? We need the thalamus to stimulate the motor cortex in order for movement to be initiated. So if the globus pallidus inhibits the thalamus is not exciting the motor cortex, so movement is inhibited. And that's kind of our baseline condition. So this globus pallidus relays information to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends projections to the motor cortex and the prefrontal cortex. And so under normal conditions, the globus pallidus is inhibiting the thalamus and movement is inhibited. So when it's damaged, movements then can become very jerky, like you see in Huntington's disease. So what happens when the caudate putamen inhibits the globus pallidus? So if this group of cells fires action potentials and inhibits the globus pallidus, now the globus pallidus is inhibited. It's no longer firing action potentials, so this goes away. So when the caudate putamen inhibits the globus pallidus, the thalamus is now free to fire action potentials and stimulate the motor cortex. So when the caudate putamen inhibits the globus pallidus, it decreases the inhibition of the thalamus, thus removing movement inhibition. So under normal circumstances, movement's inhibited, the caudate stimulates the globus pallidus, now that movement inhibition is removed. So in other words, the basal ganglia selects a movement to make by ceasing to inhibit it. So now, the substantia nigra releases dopamine, exciting the caudate putamen. What does this do to globus pallidus activity? So the caudate sends inhibitory signals to the globus pallidus via GABA. It's going to inhibit the globus pallidus activity. So what does this do to movement? Substantia nigra fires action potentials, releases dopamine in the caudate. The caudate then sends inhibitory signals via GABA to the globus pallidus, inhibiting the globus pallidus. That means the globus pallidus is no longer sending inhibitory signals to the thalamus. The thalamus can stimulate the motor cortex. And thus, the substantia nigra releasing dopamine into and exciting the caudate putamen removes the inhibition of movement. So the basal ganglia basically selects a movement to make by ceasing to inhibit it. So the baseline is we inhibit movement, okay? And then when we have this self-initiated movement we want to make because of a procedural memory, something that's implicit we don't think about, the substantia nigra fires action potential, stimulates the caudate. The caudate then inhibits the globus pallidus and keeps it from inhibiting that movement. So again, the basal ganglia selects a movement by ceasing to inhibit it.